I'm absolutely thrilled that we've got Gideon with us today. First of all, Gideon, a very happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
It was his birthday yesterday, and he and a couple of friends did their best to boost Japanese consumer spending by having a late night out. So hopefully this will make you even more eloquent
Exactly, yes.
than you usually are. I've known Gideon since about 2008, when we both were in Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong, and our task was to debate the Financial Times John authors and David Pilling. There was some, I think it was the Shanghai Literary Festival tour or something like that. And so we enjoyed that very much. And Gideon has now spent almost 3 months?
Couple of months, 2
A
months.
couple of months actually here in Tokyo. We think it's a great idea, and we're very honored to have him, give us some of the thoughts of what he's learned, what he's observed, how his opinions have changed on Japan's foreign policy and global positioning. So without further ado, Gideon is going to give 15, 20 minutes of remarks, and then we'll have a little bit of a fireside chat, and then open it up for Q&A. And for those who can't join us today live but are on video, please use your Q&A chat function to put in any questions that you would like to pose. Great. Gideon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesper, and thanks so much for inviting me. And you've kind of been the beginning and the end of my journey here, because one of the first things I did when I arrived in Tokyo was meet an old friend, and Jesper gave me some very good ideas on who to see and what to think about, so thanks for that. And I was thinking back, as he mentioned it, to that trip we did in Shanghai and Beijing in 2008, I think a little 2008-9, but what a different atmosphere it was then. And in a sense, the change in China to becoming a much more perceived as a much more threatening power, but also a much richer country, I think defines not only American foreign policy, but also Japanese foreign policy. And so it's been interesting for me. I mean, I've been basically most of my time here, but I've had a side trip to Beijing last week, be going back to Hong Kong tomorrow. And it's that sort of triangle, America, Japan, China, I think, which is so important in trying to understand how Japan makes sense of the world. And I'm consciously, I'm speaking to a room full of people who know Japan a million times better than I do. So I'm not going to lecture you too much on Japan per se, but I think what it might be useful is to give you, as I said, my impressions of how the commonalities between how Japan sees its challenges and the differences between a bunch of capitals that I do go to quite frequently. So the Americans, the Europeans, the Chinese themselves, how does Japan see it? And I think that one of the things that's really struck me is that there is a strong kind of merger at the moment between the US and the Japanese view of how the world is working, with China at its center, but not exclusively. In other words, they also share views of Russia, Ukraine, and what that means for the world. They share views about the need for friendshoring and so on. And that it's not entirely obvious that that should be how it ends up, for reasons I'll explain. But I do think that there's at the moment, and we'll see how long it lasts, a bit of a mind merge between the Japanese foreign policy elite and the US foreign policy elite as currently constituted. And there are people I know in Japan and around the world, certainly the Chinese will say, oh, well, this is just evidence of Japan being a vassal state of the United States. They just do what they're told to. But actually, one of the interesting conversations I had here in Tokyo with one of the foreign policy people, who's specialist in the US in particular, but a government person, was that he said, it's such a relief that the US now sees China the way we do. So he was saying, when he was working with the Obama administration in the early years of Obama, that when Japan was, for example, trying to get the Americans to take the issues around the Senkakus seriously, that the Americans were balancing off a bunch of other considerations. They were still at that point trying to have a
mm,
very close relationship with China because they had concerns about climate, et cetera, et cetera. And in this individual's view, and I think it is, reflected in the top level. Actually, as much as Japan coming around to America's point of view, America's come around to
mm,
Japan's point of view. Um, so, what is that? Well, I think it's broadly speaking that China is a revisionist power in Asia and in the world, and that it is out to change the power order. That involves trying to push America out of its sort of hegemonic role, as the Chinese would call it, particularly in the Asia Pacific, and that would be a threatening development to the democracies of Asia, economically, politically, and of course, as we all know, there's increasing disturbing talk about the possibility of war. Now, that talk's been around, again, it was around in 2012, around the time of the Senkaku crisis. Actually, Japan now less in the focus of it was then.
mm,
People are talking more about Taiwan and now lately about the South China Sea. But again, as you all know, one of the critical questions facing Japan, which remains ambiguous, is if a conflict broke out, would Japan be involved?
mm,
In what way? And so on. And I think those questions are kind of unanswerable because we don't know uh, what form the conflict would take, what would be happening at the time, and so on. Actually, one of when I was in Beijing, one of the Chinese said to me, "Do you think America would really go to war over Taiwan?" And I mean, maybe that's the kind of question one shouldn't answer. But I said, look, I think my guess is even Biden himself isn't entirely sure. It kind of depends on, there's stated positions and rhetorical positions, and those are all about shaping
mm,
the world at now. But when it happens, would depend on a series of events. But I think what you can say about Japan's position is that the Japanese, in the last couple of years, have done really big things in the
mm,
shifting uh, of their very constrained position on what they can do in military and strategic terms. People point above all to the big increase in defense spending, but also to other significant moves like the lifting of the absolute prohibition on arms sales so that they can sell this joint fighter that they're developing with the British and the Italians. And the sense that this is part of a process, that there's more to come here. Um, and it is striking that so much of this was achieved under Kishida rather than under Abe, who was much more noted as a more nationalistic, kind of macho style politician who was really pushing for this kind of stuff. As I understand it, Kishida was not associated
mm,
with those stances, but it's under him that it's happened. Now, why is that? Well, actually, I think unusually there's quite a simple answer to that. I mean, it seems to me, and it's one of the things that has really struck me here, that the Russian invasion of Ukraine
mm,
really has changed the atmosphere here, and that too is interesting because it's not necessarily how others in Asia see the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So, I was in Indonesia
mm,
last year, I think, and speaking to Jokowi, and it was very evident that he didn't regard it as really a problem for Indonesia. If anything, he was mildly sympathetic to the Russians, but he didn't see this as having implications for Asia. That is absolutely not the position here
mm,
in Japan. And again, it's interesting that the Japanese take that view because even in the US, there are people around Trump, particularly Elbridge Colby, who's sort of positioning himself for a big job. We'll see if he gets one, who says, well, actually, America should concentrate all its forces on Asia. Ukraine doesn't really have that many implications, or we don't, the Europeans should deal with that. But Japan has taken what is also the Biden administration position, which is that the threat here is linked to the threat in Europe. That that Putin has broken an incredibly important taboo, that if he gets away with it or it seemed to work out for him, that will embolden China. And I think, to me, there are echoes of the 1930s, and actually, it's over the years, Japanese people who've suggested to me that China is doing now what Japan was doing in the 1930s, which was attempting to challenge the US dominated world order. And I think that if you wanted to go further than that, you could say that actually, that Russia is in the position that Germany was, of this sort of revanchist power that had felt it had sustained a defeat and a humiliation and is trying to
Mm,
come back from that and change the order that it doesn't like, and that therefore you once again have a big power
mm,
in Europe and a big power in Asia in a loose partnership, um, but both with the shared ideal of changing the world. And I think that, um, again, in the 1930s, it's my understanding of Japanese decision making was that it was affected by what they saw happening in Europe. When the colonial powers seemed to be crumbling, France was occupied, the Netherlands fell. Well, at that point, Asia seemed ripe for change.
mm,
And so I think the idea that China doesn't see the significance of what's happening
mm,
in Europe is wrong, and that the Japanese position that they're correct to take an interest in what's happening. And of course, again, important things you're reminded of when you're actually living here. Russia is also a neighbor of Japan.
mm,
We think of it as a European power looking, straight at us, but it's a vast country, and so it's a close neighbor of Japan. So that is another reason.
mm,
And one of Kishida's people said to me that, you know, that they think that Japan faces the most insecure geostrategic position of any G7 member. And when I said, why? He said, well, we have China, Russia, and North Korea all as close neighbors. And put like that, you can see why you would be concerned. Um, and yet, of course, life here seems great, And I think that that's one of the interesting things about this particular moment is that for the moment, the concerns about China, although they pose a big kind of sense of foreboding, I think, particularly over the foreign policy elite who are genuinely concerned about what lies ahead in the next 10 years or so. But for the moment, I think in some ways, they're helping Japan's positioning in the world. Um, you're the economist, so you would know better than I whether it works as more than a kind of observation about time. But it is striking to me that the period where the bubble went out, the air went out of Japan, was also the period where China was rising,
mm,
more or less exactly, so that the late 80s, early 90s, things begin to tail off here. And it's around then that, Deng's Southern Tour was, I think,
mm,
91, and all the investment starts pouring into China. Now, obviously, Japan and China were started from very different points, were competing in different sectors of the market, but um, to the extent that foreign investors are beginning to say, you know what, I'm not sure we are going to make that investment in China,
mm,
or we're going to tail off there. Then I think Japan, like a lot of other countries in Asia, but Japan in particular sectors, comes back into focus. And again, as people try to make, um, I don't know whether they'll be successful, but supply chains that are much less dependent on China, you can see Japan benefiting particularly. Actually, we talked about this when we met 2 months ago in
mm,
semiconductors and the success with TSMC and so on. Um, now, here, the US is not always doesn't always live up to its rhetoric. So there are strong protectionist impulses there, and like the whole Nippon Steel case, I think, is an example of. I suspect it's some embarrassment to the U.S. embassy here, but that while America might be for interlocking the economies together in theory, in practice, if it sort of runs into election year considerations, even Japan can run into protectionist barriers in the United States. But nonetheless, I think the broad idea of trying to create less dependence on China
mm,
and more technological, particularly cooperation, not just between the US and Japan, but also between Japan and Europe, is ongoing, and the fighter project that I mentioned, the one between the UK, Italy, and Japan, is an interesting one. But finally, I mean, I think that the Japanese have introduced me to a new word, moshitora. You know, what if Trump, which is the question the question that that everybody is asking around the world. They don't all have a succinct way of putting it. Um, and that is a huge question for everybody, and it does pose the issue. Well, um, is this moment that I'm describing a very temporary one? If I come back in a year's time and Trump is president, um, has Japan had to rethink the world once again, along with all the other Western allies? And again, sorry to slightly dodge my own questions, but I think, as with the what would Biden do if China attacked Taiwan, there are too many variables to be able to say with any certainty how Trump would define the world. I mean, my view of Trump is that his priorities would be um, domestic above all. I
Mm.
mean, in the sense, and quite personal. They would be about getting back at the people who he feels have been trying to put him in prison, about restructuring the American state, about putting his people in control. And to the extent that his people um, are chosen primarily for their loyalty to Trump, what their views are of American foreign policy in Asia may be almost secondary.
Mm.
It could almost be accidental.
Mm.
Like it's this. The key is that this guy is mine, looks good on TV, and then we'll figure out the other stuff. And so just to give you an example of what I mean, people talk about, well, will Matt Pottinger, who was key in the first Trump administration, come back? And he's just written a pretty hawkish article on China for Foreign Affairs, etc., which is the kind of thing you do if you're preparing to come back into power. But a lot of Americans say to me, well, Trump won't forgive Pottinger because he resigned on January the 7th.
Mm.
And that was just, a sign that he hasn't bought into the whole election fraud idea, and that's not good enough. So I think that with a cabinet or the key positions selected on those grounds, it's difficult to know what Trump will do. And equally, if you look at Trump's own instincts, they've always been a bunch of competing things. He's highly protectionist, that we know, and I think that Japan has reason to be concerned about. One of the Japanese policy people said to me they're nervous about Robert Lighthizer, who they believe still to be very close to Trump, who is sort of Mr. Tariff. Trump has, I think, already said that he'll put a 10% tariff on all exports. But Trump says a lot of things. I mean, Trump also said he would ban all Muslims from entering the United States. What he says and what he does, they don't always match, although they might. Um, so there's the protectionism. There is the I want to be tough thing, which might suggest a policy in Asia that is even more hawkish than Biden. Um, and if you look again at some of the people in Trump world, Pompeo has talked about recognizing Taiwan as an independent state, which I think even the Taiwanese would be a bit nervous about. But I think Trump's own instincts are to do kind of big man to big man deals with authoritarian leaders.
Mm.
That you saw him attempt to do that with Kim Jong Un. If you look at, say, the way that John Bolton and Fiona Hill, who worked quite closely with him, write about the way he interacted with people, the people he got on with were people like Orban and indeed Xi Jinping. He's quite effusive in his praise of Xi at times. So my guess is that he would see it, the way he would approach it would be a bit like a sort of New York real estate deal, is that you act tough, you walk out the room, you say, I'm not doing this, but always with the idea that in the end there'll be a big bargain and everything sorted all out. You can have this, I'll have that, everybody's happy. I don't think he has any interest in going to war over Taiwan. And So if that is your primary concern, if you for those who are very worried by the sense that we may be heading towards a war, actually, I think in that respect, Trump probably, my guess would is that tensions might eventually ease under him because of his make a deal instincts. But whether that deal that he would make would be good for East Asia or good for Japan is a different question. So I'll leave it there, but happy to continue the discussions.
Whoa, that's thank you. That's quite a lot. Let me start with sort of one overarching question and just take it down. Sort of, you've been in Tokyo now for the last couple of months, right? You've had many conversations with
Yeah.
different types of people.
Yeah.
We all take on board that, Abe was much more hawkish, as it were. I think we take on board that, oh, finally, the Americans look at China the way we've always looked at China. Just to push back against that, that's not the discussion that you would have at the Keidanren, at the big business community, because China is Japan's largest trade partner on both exports and imports. The Japan-China relationship is actually one of the densest relationships that we have in the world. Yeah. 1/3 of the graduate students at Japanese universities are nationals from the People's Republic of China.
Sure.
And it's not just a huge market, but it's also a huge pool of labor, and human capital that interacts very, very closely. A quarter, give or take, of listed companies' profits here in Japan comes from producing or partnering or exporting to the People's Republic of China. So it's quite sort of more a German type conundrum that the Japanese have. Have you picked up any of this as well? I mean, we know the Foreign Office's line, but on the ground, there are certainly several people who suggest that Prime Minister Kishida's unpopularity is in part due to the fact that indeed he has turned Japan into, as former Prime Minister Nakasone said, America's unsinkable aircraft carrier.
Yeah. Well, you're right. I've spent more time with the foreign policy types, and that can skew your view. But yeah, I have picked up some of that from business people. Actually, even before coming to Japan, I remember moderating a panel on Japan at the World Economic Forum, and Tak, the guy from Nianami from Suntory, was one of my panelists, and there was an American on the panel who was actually, I think, a business person, a management consultant, and he was very much pushing the offshoring, friendshoring, sort of decoupling line. And Tak pushed back really quite hard and said, no, business with China is expanding, and that is a good thing. And of course, we need to protect ourselves in strategic areas, but not. We're not going to decouple, and we're not indeed even going to try to make our trade less. We still see this as the biggest opportunity facing us. And so, in the couple of months I've been here, when I have encountered business people, I've sort of told that story and said, where do you stand on that issue? And yeah, it's not at all a minority position. So talking to the car companies, somebody said to me, well, if EVs run into trouble, Chinese-made EVs, that's a big problem for Nissan because they're planning to make them out of China. On the other hand, somebody connected to Toyota said to me, yeah, but Toyota's taken a slightly different line. They're still very into hybrids, and also they're planning to make EVs here in Japan. So different companies are taking different strategies. But I think that it's also true that it's not a uniquely Japanese dilemma or tension. You see it right across the Western world. You mentioned Germany. Obviously, we saw Scholz's visit there, and it seems that even though you could say that German industry is about to be dismantled by China's prowess in electric vehicles, I think that the German car companies who weigh very heavily have decided that closing the market is not an option, that the Chinese market is way too important to them, and that they're going to they're going to do licensing, joint ventures, all of that. And so Germany's taking quite a soft line. It'd be very interesting to see what happens with Xi in France
Mm,
right now, because the French are more instinctively protectionist.
mm,
Um, seem to be backing the European Commission's increasingly uh, hard line on not just on EVs but on everything: solar panels, medical devices. There's been a whole bunch of European probes into Chinese overproduction, and yet the Chinese are beginning to retaliate, have put tariffs on French cognac, which is not a joke. You know, it's a big thing for them, big export. Um, and that's just a foretaste, ho ho, of what might be to come. And will they make a compromise? Somebody was just texting me this morning saying, actually, what Macron wants is a BYD factory in France,
mm, mm.
and that might be the deal. So we'll see. But I don't think, as I say, it's a uniquely Japanese tension, and I don't think it'll ever be purely unless we have a geopolitical catastrophe of the sort
Mm.
that happened with Russia. I don't think it'll ever be completely resolved. People will have to try to balance them at the same time, and a lot of policy will be contradictory. And actually, just to finish on, I mean, even the Americans, you totally see it all the time. So that Gino Raimondo will go to Beijing and say, "No, no, we want to increase trade with you." They say, "What? I thought that wasn't the policy." But she is the Commerce Secretary, and so even some of the national security types will say, "No, no, it's misunderstood. We're not waging economic war on China at all. We're just simply trying to protect ourselves and make sure that we don't sell them anything that's going to end up in a missile that's one day fired at American troops. That's all it is."
Small yard, tall fences.
Exactly. That's it. Yeah. So, yeah. But as I say, I think, as I was saying in my talk, the shadow of the
Mm.
Ukraine war is over all of this. So while at the moment people say we're just going to have to kind of navigate this through on a case by case basis and a company by company and sector by sector basis, and there is always the fear that, well, if there's a huge confrontation, have we made ourselves crazily dependent on China in a way that we're going to really regret?
Mm, mm, mm. America drawing inwards,
Mm.
possibly becoming more unpredictable, run by octogenarians.
Yeah.
And, sort of, when you look at Japan, I mean, they've done a lot of things right. No, it sometimes seems like Japan is the only country in Asia that speaks up for multilateralism.
Yeah.
Right? What are your thoughts on these different alliances? It obviously started with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the Americans obviously, for one reason or another, couldn't join. But Japan has kept it. And
Yeah.
we've now got the Quad. We've got all these new acronyms of multilateral cooperation going on in Asia, led ultimately by the Japanese. I mean, do you think Japan can become a mediator?
I think so, because with the obvious exceptions of Korea and China, which are important ones, you don't generally come across countries that feel hostile to Japan in the rest of Asia.
Hmm.
There's not this sort of innate suspicion that you have both of the US and of China. Um, Perhaps because Japan is not, a superpower,
Hmm.
and it's not going to be one. So there's a sense that the Japanese are that they're obviously still enormous respect for Japanese technology, brands, modernity. So there's a lot about Japan that people want, but they don't feel that Japan is trying to push them around or that Japan can push
Hmm.
them around. So in that sense, they're slightly more likely to say, okay, we're prepared to listen to the Japanese.
Hmm.
Obviously, the Japanese-Indian relationship is very
Right.
important, and India is a awkward but indispensable partner for the West. So, to the extent that Japan can be part of
Hmm.
trying to sort of bring them along and get them to see things more our way than certainly the Russian way,
Yeah.
that's extremely helpful. And as you say, that when Trump pulled America out of the TPP, that must have been a crushing blow to, or it could have been a crushing blow
Hmm.
to many in Japan, because Japan had put so much into that. And yet the way that Abe himself responded was very, he just kind of, swallowed whatever anger he may have had and built from there. Rebuilt a relationship with Trump, kept the TPP alive, um, and I mean, actually, as a Brit, I must say, I've been interested by, Britain, by sounds a bit silly, but how seriously the Japanese take Britain, because in Europe, the relationship is so bad, and we're used to having this very unequal relationship with the United States, close but unequal. Um, but the Japanese do seem to see the UK as quite a useful partner. Hence, I was thinking of it in the context of the TPP. They really encouraged Britain to join the TPP, which was portrayed in the UK, particularly in the press, which is very hostile to Brexit, as a sort of ridiculous thing. Like, why would you do that? It's the other side of the world. But actually, I think is potentially quite a useful thing to do. And then you can see other bits of that relationship, the defense bits, the diplomatic bits, coming up. So I think Japan is quite adept developing those relationships with other middle powers, and the other middle powers are very keen to develop the relationship with Japan, because of all the different things it brings to the table.
It's interesting, right? Because I mean, it's almost like Japan and Britain or the UK now are the only relatively independent, right? Sort of immediate, sort of middle powers,
Yeah,
right?
they're
Because
not.
everybody else is like, whether it's Germany, whether it's France, there's a significant, sort of stranglehold because of the EU relations, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is one of the things about leaving the EU. I think it's damaged our economy, but it does give you a broader range of choices in what you can do. For example, I don't think Britain would have done AUKUS if we'd been in the EU, because it involved confronting France in a way that would have just been very, very difficult if you're inside the EU. So yeah, I think that is the case.
I'm going to ask a difficult question, but I'm going to ask it pretty straight. Do you think in 5 or 10 years' time, Japan will have a nuclear bomb?
I think it's no, but it's certainly not out of the question. Um, that the scenario is pretty obvious, that particularly if Trump were to come in, but even if you had a Democrat administration, a Biden administration, or a Harris administration, which seemed less reliable, which had sort of America had been unable to sustain its support for Ukraine. Ukraine had fallen. People felt that the U.S. guarantee was less and less reliable. Then at that point, um, Japan and a lot of other countries might begin to think about nuclear weapons. I think the before I was here, I spent a month in Australia, and they have a very interesting debate, because at the moment, a bit like Japan, they've gone all in on America.
Yep.
That's been their response. But then there's a sort of significant and quite smart dissident group in Australia who say this ain't going to work.
Right.
And their argument is, in the long run, we're just going to have to concentrate on defending our rather large island, and we're going to have to acquire nuclear weapons.
Yep.
And so, yes, I think a lot of countries are thinking about it. So we may be at some point in a new era of nuclear escalation. The reason I was initially said no is that I think, as you know, the taboo in Japan is that much higher.
Right.
I think although people say that Japan is technically able to do it faster than almost anybody, politically difficult.
It's very interesting. I mean, I mean, as you may know, Tokyo Governor Yuriko Koike is the only nationally, known politician who openly advocates that Japan should get its own, nuclear capability.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a technical question. It's
No.
more a question of whether the Americans would allow for Japan to have its own nuclear.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Deterrent.
But also I would think domestic opinion. But
no, domestic opinion is obviously domestic opinion in these matters is terribly complex, right?
Yeah.
But it changes very fast because of demographics.
Right. I mean, I think the other thing that I want to write about at some point, but I haven't thought it through yet. But is the way in which the Ukraine war will change the way
Mm,
that people think about nuclear weapons in
mm,
all sorts of ways. Because one of the things that
mm.
has been hovering over all of this is Russia's occasional, not so veiled threats that they might use nuclear weapons, which has, without doubt, inhibited American action.
Mm,
It's why they placed a lot of constraints on Ukraine, and at various points, the US has thought, oh, they're actually on the point of doing this.
mm, mm.
That when Kherson, when the Russians lost Kherson, I think the Americans really thought there was a strong chance that
Right,
that Putin might use a nuclear weapon to try, as a kind of last resort thing.
right.
And he hasn't. But how do we interpret that?
Mm,
Has have we discovered from this war that actually these things are useless because like nobody will ever use them, because, or have we discovered that actually they've helped Russia
mm,
because the mere possession of them has inhibited the way that the kind of aid that people will give to Ukraine?
mm,
Is one of the lessons we've drawn that Ukraine's original and disastrous error was to give up their nuclear
mm,
weapons?
mm.
Don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have a, sorry, before I open it up to two questions,
Yeah.
one point while we're on the subject of Ukraine, what is your current sort of end game scenario for the Ukraine?
I don't really have one. I So, I mean, I think that there would have been a really quite alarming end game if the aid hadn't gone through.
Mm,
That I think Russia would have made a big military breakthrough quite this year probably, and might even have attempted to go all the way to Kiev, because once fronts start crumbling, um, I think that's much less likely now, although not impossible, because one of the closely guarded secrets of this was how many people have Ukraine actually lost.
mm,
The average, we do know, or said that the average age of the soldier on the front line in Ukraine is 43.
mm,
So it's not impossible that Russia will make a breakthrough. It seems very unlikely that Ukraine will make a breakthrough this year.
mm,
Jake Sullivan was talking about them going back on the offensive next year. Um, but at the moment, we're back at the sort of stalemate thing. But stalemates don't last forever. There is hope that finally the damage to the Russian economy will become more serious next year. But we've been saying that for a while. So at the moment, it's a bit stuck.
mm, mm. Let me open it up for questions from the audience. Tony.
Thank you. I think probably most of the people in this room and on video are also concerned about the potential for a Trump victory, which is certainly real. You characterize the our attempt or your attempt to prophesize about it as being difficult because he's inconsistent and you didn't say venal, but perhaps that's a correct characterization. One thing he has been consistent about has been his indifference at best and subservience at worst to Russia.
Yeah.
And a new administration, Trump administration, is certainly not going to be supportive of Ukraine, as you point out. There are those of us who think that his bluster toward China is in many ways a way of distracting from his willingness to give up on Europe and on Russia. And so, if Russia gains in Ukraine and a Trump administration decides not to support Asia and to withdraw, what should Japan do? I mean, what should the world do? But what should Japan do? Because there's a realistic, I think, possibility that the anti-China rhetoric is in fact just rhetoric, and he has no interest whatsoever in supporting Japan or Asia.
Well, I mean, I think good question, because as you know, Japan's entire sort of security stance for the last 75 years has been built around the American alliance. So if that disappears, I don't think there is much you can't compensate for that overnight, or even probably it would, over the course of a decade. Um, but I doubt it would ever be. I don't think Trump would repeal those treaties. They would remain there. So I think that what's that? He could indeed withdraw troops. Look, I guess the obvious things, he would have to start looking for friends in the neighborhood, rearming, etc. Unless the only other option would be to do some sort of accommodatory agreement with China, and to say, okay, we I mean, obviously, everyone already has a one China policy, but being much more explicit on distancing yourself from Taiwan, whatever else, recognizing their claims to the South China Sea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those would be difficult things to do, but I guess for a while you could live with them. The question is, of course, is, well, what comes next? Does China have designs on Okinawa, for example, which is often said? So I think that would be a very difficult course for Japan to take, but and I suspect it wouldn't be the first choice. I think the first choice would be to try to reconstruct other forms of alliances, but there is no second United States. Australia doesn't cut it. India is very internally focused. And I mean, I've seen the Indian policy people say in terms, look, there's no way we're getting involved over Taiwan. That's your problem. Um, so I don't think, and yeah, so there isn't a clear answer to that, because there just is no U.S. subsidy sitting there.
Thank you, Mr. Rachman. I'm a retired diplomat. I spent 13 years in Europe, subscribing to the FT.
Good.
It is important to deal with China and Russia properly, but also it is important to keep so-called global South on our side.
Yeah.
And that has been one of the strengths of Japanese diplomacy in the past. But what worries me is the division of America, and also the growing criticisms of double standard the West is taking the Ukraine and Israel.
Sure.
So that's weakens our position. What do you think we should do?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there's no doubt that that's right, and that certainly being in Beijing, they were very keen to make Gaza a big talking point, et cetera, et cetera. And the West does have responses to these arguments. Israel was attacked, Ukraine did not attack Russia, et cetera. But I wouldn't expect those arguments to win. Emotionally, they don't work, even if you can construct a sort of intellectual argument. So I think I mean, I have a bad feeling about it. I think that a lot of this damage is going to last quite a long time. I don't think it's going to be easily recovered. But I suppose I'd say two things about it. One is that in the end, countries pursue their interests as much, whatever they, just as we were saying, people have interests in China, even if they're very wary of the Chinese. So people may think the West is a bunch of hypocrites, et cetera, et cetera. But if they need the market, or they need the West support on something, or they'll still that will weigh very, very heavily. It'll weigh most, really. And similarly, these moral arguments, people chuck them around, but I was amused in a grim sort of way. Brazil, for example, Lula said that what Israel was doing in Gaza was like the Holocaust. But then I noticed, like last week, Brazil has just announced it's buying howitzers from Israel. So people aren't always entirely consistent in the arguments they're making. But I think the other thing that you can do on a more practical level, other than just saying we're going to have to live with it for a while, is what the Biden administration is trying to do, which is bring this to a close, have a peace deal, turn it into something like a positive by having an overall deal which involves Saudi Israeli normalization in return for Israel committing to a two-state solution, and hope that over time that calms everything down. And you have seen surges of these sentiments before, always in wartime. The first Intifada, the second Intifada, the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and eventually they calmed down. You could argue that Israel's long-term trajectory has actually been towards greater acceptance in the region, from a position in 1948 where no country accepted them to peace deal with Egypt, and then the Abraham Accords, and this has been punctuated by conflicts, but the long-term trajectory has been in that direction. I would like to believe that that could still be the case, although I think what's happened in Gaza is of a sort of level of death and destruction that we haven't seen before, and therefore it's a new situation.
It was very interesting too that how do you define the global South? And one of my mentors, who's a rather cynical American, said the global South is where the sons and daughters of the ruling elite are busy applying for an American green card. But the point is a serious one, which is fine. We can all get upset about America, right? Which is nice. The question is, where is their intellectual leadership? You will still rather send your son to Stanford, Oxford, or, God forbid, Heidelberg University than to Beijing University or to Jakarta University. So it's quite interesting that we are actually kind of lost, to some extent in terms of where does the intellectual leadership come from?
Yeah, and I think those are good questions. Where do people put their money? Where do they put their kids? And the thing you referred to earlier, the influx of Chinese into Tokyo is very telling. And in fact, when I mentioned it in Beijing, partly to needle this guy I was talking to, and said, "It's been so interesting being in Japan. There's so many Chinese people," and he said, "Very small number. They didn't want to hear it." It's like, so yeah.
Thank you. I have a question about you introduced the word middle powers in today's talk. I was wondering if we will want to promote the democracy through the multinational corporations, which countries will be the key for Japan, United States, or UK? Because the authoritarian leaders' countries are getting stronger and they are likely to maintain their regimes.
Yeah.
How could democracy nations can promote multinational corporations and to under the name of the peace, and then also the multinational military corporations? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the trouble with democracy promotion, which I'm all in favor of, is that authoritarian governments don't like it. So you end up in confrontations because you're often supporting movements that are, people power movements, etc., etc. Hong Kong is a classic example of that. But and also it's incredibly hard to be very consistent over these things. Again, it comes back to the question of double standards and so on. We were, I mean, if you look at, say, the US's treatment of India, the Indians have actually, as far as we can tell, attempted to assassinate somebody on American soil. Now, if China had done that, or America would have gone absolutely crazy. But given it's India, and there are other interests at stake, they haven't let it drop, and we'll see. Maybe there will be a prosecution. It's seriously embarrassing for India, but there's not going to be a diplomatic rift over it. Both sides will try to keep it together. So, democracy promotion, I think, I don't think it's an ideal we should let go of, because it is about who we are, and also I think that actually it is of geostrategic importance, because authoritarian governments tend to band together and democratic governments tend to band together. And I think even in this region, you can see as countries move, because there's so many countries that move from one margin to the other, um, if a country moves in an authoritarian direction, it's also much more likely to move in a more pro-China direction, because they know the Chinese aren't going to give them a hard time, that they'll support them indeed, and they're worried that the West will give them a hard time. Myanmar's a good example of that. Once you have or indeed Thailand. Once the military come in, they're more likely to start cultivating ties with the Chinese. So it's not just a sort of soft-hearted thing about. I mean, I think the values part is very important, partly because we could all at some point imagine that we're in a situation where our country is losing its democracy, and we would hope that the rest of the world would make a fuss or support us, or if we. So that's important. But also, I just think in strategic terms, democracies tend to be more countries that want to do business with the Japan or the United States, or the European Union, whereas authoritarian countries band together. My kind of friend and colleague, Anne Applebaum, has just written a whole book about this called Autocracy Inc., about how autocracies try to prop each other up. And in terms of how you do it, look, there's a whole toolbox. I think support for NGOs, etc. That's become increasingly contentious, because I think it's not an accident that countries like China and Russia close down Western-supported NGOs, because they regard them as tools of the West. They don't accept that they're non-governmental, but nonetheless, I think that those are important. But also, even if we get accused of being hypocritical, support for certain standards, freedom of speech, etc., etc. I mean, I'm sure it's a massive headache for the American government that the State Department is mandated to produce a report around the world on press freedom and so on, because it ends up pissing off a lot of American allies who get told they're doing the wrong thing. But I think it's important that somebody does it, and that you have organizations like Freedom House, etc., that benchmark and try to keep monitoring this stuff.
Thank you for your insights and thoughts. You began to say a little bit about Russia, its economy, and sanctions. It'd be great if you could just expand your thinking a bit on how effective that's been so far. And also, I guess one question would be, where next if you don't believe sanctions have been effective, and if countries are interested in deepening or furthering them, can they go any further? Where could they go next? Thank you.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that is one of the disappointments, if you like, of this whole conflict, is that at the beginning there was this sense that America had, and the West in general, had this sort of bazooka that they could aim at Russia and take it down quite quickly. And people were talking about, maybe the Russian economy is shrinking by 20%. And it just didn't. So that, just as the Russian military, at least in the first phase of the war, did far worse than we thought it would, the Russian economy did far better than we thought it would. And the question is that why has that happened? Partly, I think, because this sanctions regime is not global, so they can sell their oil to India above all, and then the oil gets out on the global market, and so it's costly. It's not as efficient for them, but they can still make money off that. Gas sales, I think, are a bit of a problem for them. I mean, so it's possible that we've given up too soon, and that the damage will begin to tell over time. Not given up, but that we've written off sanctions as a tool. I noticed that Gazprom had a huge loss because, unlike oil, which is quite easy to divert to other markets, gas goes through fixed links. So that's a problem. And also, although people point to Russia's growth figures, a lot of that growth is rearmament, which is not a very productive way of running the economy. They've lost a lot of people in this war, killed, wounded, but also a lot of people who just left the country. Talented people they need who've picked up. So I think over the long run, this cannot be good for the Russian economy. But it's an authoritarian regime. So even if people's living standards are dropping, it doesn't mean that that Putin's going to go or face a threat. He can just arrest people, forever, really. It may damage their ability to fight, but if the waging war is the sole focus of the state, um, they they can probably keep military production going for quite a while. But I think there are still further things to do, and in fact, the FT was reporting on it just now, which is that secondary sanctions, that the US is gearing up to go after the banks that are acting as intermediaries for Russia, and that remains, despite talk of the erosion of the dollar as the main currency and so on. Um, Jesper's the finance guy, but it's still a bit of a disaster for you, or indeed unsustainable if you're shut out of the dollar system and you're trying to be a global bank. So that remains a massive threat. And if America and OFAC in the Treasury can make that threat, which was, I think, the one that people were looking at initially, much more real, then maybe there's still stuff to do. I don't know, Jesper, what do you think?
No, I think, look, I mean, to isolate somebody from the global system sounds very easy, but it's not, because a lot of things are fungible, and you do have partners who are very willingly, capable of buying things up, right? And then you've got this merry-go-round where Germany can't buy gas from Russia anymore, so they go and buy it up at, higher spot prices, elsewhere, right? So, I mean, we have globalized for basically the last 150 years. So the linkages and the densities and the fungibility of, of trade, right, is actually always very, very surprising. I mean, I always joke with my American friends, because it's like, look at North Korea. North Korea has had sanctions ever since I was out of diapers, which was just 3 years ago. No, but North Korea, and still the missiles they keep building keep getting better. So obviously something gets through, right? So I think there's a couple of questions from the global audience.
Yes, we have one question from Professor Tomohiko Taniguchi, who's one of our first speakers on the series. Way back when. And it's about UK. A change of government now seems likelier than ever in the UK. Can we assume that the continuity improving bilateral relationships evidenced by GCAP, Hiroshima Accord, and now JOCUS will remain unchanged?
I think yes, actually, and I can say that with some confidence, because I was actually texting with one of the Labour people who's involved with this yesterday, who was saying, how is Japan going? And he said, we're really keen to get across the message that we're committed to GCAP, that we're committed to all the Indo-Pacific stuff that the current government is doing, because as I say, a lot of political commentary in Britain had treated the Indo-Pacific stuff as sort of just a way of trying to rationalize Brexit and really not very worthwhile. I think there could be a legitimate question as to whether a non-Tory government would say, well, look, this is not really what we're interested in. But the message that Labour are sending out is very much on the contrary. We really want to continue with this stuff. So I think the answer to that is a pretty unequivocal yes.
I've always viewed the decoupling more as a pandemic issue. Seeing the satellite images of Chinese ports basically crammed with ships because they couldn't move. And I think that's kind of the reason why you have Taiwan being one of the major reasons. It's really the leader of decoupling by moving into Kyushu with TSMC, into US with TSMC and others. But my question is, if you look at one, is there really a possibility that America would ever attack China and America would ever go to war? Because you have all the logistics issues for Japan of self-sufficiency of 37% right now, 35%.
Yeah.
All the ship transport would have to skip the Straits of Malacca, go around Indonesia,
sure,
and add weeks. The Taiwanese, obviously, it's critical to them. I was just there. There's a bunker everywhere now. I mean, everybody has a basement to escape to with the missiles flying over it every day, basically, right now. But is it really possible? Because you have two security, UN Security Committee powers. If they attack each other, my understanding of reinsurance is that immediately all insurance of logistics stops.
Right.
Which would mean no logistics, which would mean Japan at self-sufficiency of 37% is looking about, what, a month of survival till it really has to start panicking.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the possibility of a war, of America fighting a war for Taiwan with China, to me is 0.05% unless Japan becomes the face of it because it's not a member of the Security Council.
So, I mean, just quickly on the first thing you pointed, I think you're right about the pandemic. I think that was one of the things that really made people think, hang on, you know, this global economy is almost too integrated and too efficient. We need to have alternatives and so on. I remember a British national security official saying they'd discovered that there was a single factory in Malaysia that made 80% of the world's rubber gloves. You know, which suddenly who'd cared or thought about that, but suddenly rubber gloves were incredibly important. And so that was along with this rise. And then I think the Russia-Ukraine war also was another reminder that you can build up a dependency on a single source that is incredibly vulnerable. As for the war idea, yeah, I mean, it would be a disaster on many, many levels, not least economic. But is it possible? And that's partly why I share some of your skepticism. But is it possible America would fight a war? Yeah, definitely, because it's both sides are planning for a war. It's quite spooky. I mean, you know, there's no doubt about it. You know that. I mean, I remember, for example. And in some level, it does seem like complete madness, you know. But I remember sitting in the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is the main security event, and the Chinese defense minister, who's purged shortly afterwards, gave a pretty bellicose speech. And I was sitting next to a senior American military guy, and he said to me afterwards, "Oh well, I mean, you know, if that means what it says, there's clearly going to be a war." And I said, "You know, really, you know, have you thought through the escalation risks of that?" And he said, "Oh yeah, we war game it all the time, you know, and it gets existential pretty quickly." And I'm great. and, but yeah, they do war game it all the time. Both sides do, and these are real preparations. And Biden has said 4 times that America would defend Taiwan. Now, a lot of it is about it's about deterrence, you know. And again, talking to non-Americans, Australians on this occasion about all the preparations they were making for a potential conflict, and saying, as you just, this is, you know, feels very dangerous. And the guy I was speaking to said, yeah, but you've got to remember, it's all about preventing a war rather than fighting one. But it's based around a theory of deterrence, that if you make yourself frightening enough, China won't try it. And if that theory works, great, although it's an expensive theory to put into practice. But if it doesn't, then you're faced with a very difficult question. And as I said earlier, I don't know how America would answer it, but might they go to war? Yeah, I think very, very much a possibility. But and again, you know, talking about this subject, which comes up a lot with an American, and I raised some of the issues that you said about these dependencies, you know, chips coming out of Taiwan, and this guy who's, you know, in the government said, yeah, but, you know, frankly, if there's a war between the US and China, the supply of chips for your iPhone is going to be the least of your concerns.
Exactly.
You know, there's so many other dangerous things that come into play then.
Just for 30 seconds, from an economic perspective, China is the largest importer of food and the largest importer of energy in the world. And so if you were to, as it were, blockade the People's Republic of China, right, you'd have different problems than just trying to figure out where to get your next air conditioner from.
I guess my cynicism is, when the presidential election is held in November, what's going to happen the next day is either the Democrats or the Republicans are going to go to court and say that the other did not win the war, win the election.
Yeah, sure.
And it's going to, we'll have Biden there for another 6 months to a year because there will be no resolution to the election because.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that that is probably if I was an American ally, I guess I am. The biggest concern is not so much the one we all focus on, which is a conscious change of policy. It's America falling into chaos. And just being so dysfunctional that they're so busy trying to imprison each other, or that there are so many riots in every university in America that they're just unable to focus on the world. That, I think, is the real danger at the moment. And incidentally, of course, the Russians and Chinese totally understand it, which is why Russia spends so much time sort of trying to stir things up on social media. And in a sense, they're projecting their own experience of the collapse of the Soviet Union onto the United States. Because the reason they lost the Cold War was not because this tank battle that everyone had been preparing for 40 years took place. It's because they collapsed internally. So their bet is maybe we can make America collapse internally, and wouldn't that be sweet?
This is a question from one of our founding members, Hendrik Ordenkar. The wars in Ukraine and Gaza have created new energy and security concerns and have taken away attention from addressing climate change. Do you see the climate change getting greater attention anytime soon?
Well, no, I don't think it's going to go off the international agenda. But I don't think it's going to dominate it, short of some environmental catastrophe that makes people refocus. But on the other hand, I think that sort of my reading of it more is that actually there's quite a lot of environmental change baked into, not fast enough, but if you take the climate scientists' projections seriously about what we need to do by when, we're not going to get there. But nonetheless, Europe is committed to a net zero target. If you look at Britain, for example, we have said every car on the road has to be an EV by some date really quite soon. All of that's baked in theory. So I think what's more likely to happen than an acceleration is actually a political backlash in the West and maybe elsewhere saying, this stuff's too expensive. We're not going to do it. We're going to delay it. And that's going to be one of the big causes of the populist parties. And you've already, actually quite a lot of populism in the West, it has been quite connected to backlashes against the expensive environmental policies. The original Gilets jaunes protests in France were actually sparked by Macron increasing duties on fuels to try to discourage people. So this stuff is, and in Germany, as you know, the whole heat pump thing was really destructive for the governing parties. So I fear that governing parties are going to begin to back away from some of this stuff and delay it. They'll remain rhetorically committed, but they'll try to soften it around the edges.
Gideon, thank you. This was fascinating. We could go on forever, particularly if we serve you a little sake, which I hope you've grown fond of here. Want to thank everybody, for coming. I think may you live in interesting times, but certainly Japan's position, is actually, quite an interesting one. When you and I met, first, it was still across Asia. It wasn't easy to find a true friend of Japan. Well, I think now, over the last 20 years, right? Certainly Japan has friends, whether it's, because a lot of the Asian countries, in effect, are very similar. To where Japan is, sort of stuck between, two hyperpowers, two superpowers who are competitive, but those two superpowers, also both of them for different reasons have become increasingly untrustworthy. And as a result of that, this whole point about self-sufficiency, independence, and greater alliance forging outside of the two superpower framework is probably something that we can look forward to. I want to thank you very much. I also want to thank you and the audience.